Hey everyone. Hopefully you're having a good week. I am doing one last teaching demonstration, and that is for the different weeks that we have to get you moving in towards the final. Um, I was going to start out with some of the stuff on evaluation, which is like the part where you evaluate your group. It's good for writing the paper. So you all be presenting a group and maybe do a girl circle. But with that being said, I want you all to know how to evaluate it, and that's a piece you would put into your paper. So here's the review.
Welcome to our lecture on evaluation as part of our group skills in substance abuse counseling course. In addition to an exploration of evaluation and group work, this lecture will also include specific descriptions of how the week's materials fit into your group project. As you know, your group project will describe a group intervention, and the proposal will describe the specific population you have selected, as well as the type and the purpose of the group. Further, your group will outline the screening criteria for members, as well as group size, the group goals, an exploration of legal, ethical, and cultural considerations for your group, and termination criteria and outcome measures. The final portion of your group project will be a member progress update created for a fictional member of the group that you've created. In this progress update, you will describe and summarize a fictional client's behavior within your group based on any information you choose to include. You must describe the client's progress and identify the needs and issues that may require a modification in your treatment plan. This progress report should be written from the perspective of the group leader following the 6th session of the group. Be sure to include initial goals and any modifications based on your report. Please refer to the assignment reading rubric for more information, and be sure to use the document as your primary source as your group puts together the group project. Keep in mind that I'm happy to read and provide feedback on drafts that I receive on or before the date out.
So that's the intro for next week. I know we have this starting, so we're going to go ahead and start it now.
I'm so confused at this point.
Yes. Political science,
Okay.
specializing in public administration and public policy.
Fantastic.
Hello, Dr. Trout.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Hello.
Are you on campus?
I am on campus, yes. It's this class that I thought they were using for their teaching demonstration. Is Andrew coming?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And did you get my email? I do have a senior in that class that's low enrollment. I know that changes.
Well, unfortunately, the provost office, didn't really acknowledge any of that.
Oh, okay.
They said, we're just going to go by the numbers. We don't care.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sorry. Yeah, that compensation would be prorated, and you may have seen that in your pay stub already.
Oh, did they already pay us? I thought they were paying at midnight.
No, but the pay stubs are posted.
Oh, okay.
I already got paid.
Okay. Yeah, when do they give us our raises too? Does that ever come in? 2%.
Yeah, I don't know if that has been applied to our salaries. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it.
Well, excuse me. Jonathan, have you been working on the online teaching certifications?
Yeah, I've done the A, It's also a challenge because we're not certified to be online, and then to say that we get that to be able to do online, it's like it counters each other. So I've done A. I was going to go over there for B when classes end, as I know they want them by really mid-July. So um, I I would like for our program to get certified online, though. That would be awesome.
Oh, that's what you meant, like the social work program is not accredited or approved for online teaching.
Right. Yeah. So everything's in person. If I do the certification, they even said, yeah, you don't have to do it. So I might be one of the only ones.
Yeah, if you're not teaching online, you don't need to.
Right. I've still done it, because there was all that confusion for months and months. I've literally almost done half of it, but
I see. I see.
we still have
So
2
there
more
was-
weeks.
Yeah, we do. So there was a meeting yesterday with coordinators and chairs, and the meeting was called by Dr. McSwain, but she was not there. Miss Tina Jones, who is now Miss Tina Cornett,
Oh,
she ran the meeting,
okay.
and so there was some discussion about what the expectations are, and hopefully there will be. And we all asked for a clear statement. So some people said that when it comes to module C, it's not like you have to build the content as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have existing content and you're simply assembling it
Mm-hmm.
as per the checklists, then that is fine. So technically, instructors could use a master shell, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
and just use that content for their own sandbox. So that would suffice. Is that what you did, Genevieve, or did you create a new?
Yeah, I was creating the master course for the OER for social problems.
Oh.
And so I was already in the process of doing that, and I just submitted it.
So if you already had content, would it have saved time, you think? Or,
Oh, yeah.
And how much time would it take?
It wouldn't have saved time.
Well, you have to,
I already taught the course online.
Put it in piece by piece,
so
don't you?
It was basically putting that content into a master course, which I was doing because of the OER. Because I redesigned it for OER last semester before, I don't remember. But
Okay.
but the biggest things were I had to, like, the course map took forever, and they weren't happy with the one that I already had in there. They wanted a more detailed one, and so the things that I had to change, I would have had to change it. Okay.
Are you guys accredited in
you say it
Schoology?
took you a couple of weeks?
Yeah.
Did you also do
Back and
this?
forth with Dr. Bella. Not full time. It probably took me 3 full days. But it was, Dr. Bella would get it, she'd review it, send it back to me. So it probably took a couple of weeks of back and forth with Dr. Bella, but it probably took me 3 full days overall to redesign content.
Right. Well, Jonathan, you were saying something, but I see the candidate is
Right.
copy.
Just that we did this already with Schoology, and I did it 3 years ago for Canvas.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to admit him, and then we'll,
Admit.
Thank you. Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so we are using a class, but we record the lectures and make those available for students to view later on. So you may or may not see students present right now, but we have with us faculty from the department. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Andrew Smith. Once again, it's a pleasure to have you meet with us, and we are looking forward to your teaching demonstration. Thank you.
All right. As Dr. Johar said, my name is Dr. Andrew Smith. I am a professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And today, as part of my job talk, I am going to, give a talk on, sorry, I'm trying to set up the screen as well. Can everybody see the slides now? Does everybody see a PowerPoint?
Now
Yes.
I do.
Excellent. Okay, sorry about that. Today's part of my job talk, I am going to be lecturing on elections and voting in the U.S. Now, in real life, elections and voting would be a multi-unit affair, but given the time constraints, I'm only going to cover a couple of topics. If there's anything that you are more interested in that I don't cover, such as gerrymandering or super PACs, please feel free to ask me questions at the end so that I can answer anything that I didn't cover. And with that, let's start with some basic facts about voting. Per the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, you must be at least 18 years of age or older. You also must be registered to vote in your state and county. And here I've included a link that you can click on to see if you are registered to vote in Ohio and where you can go vote as well. In Ohio, you can also register to vote online, something that you cannot do in all states for reasons I'll explain in a bit. There are several different ways one can cast their ballot in Ohio. One of these is early voting. Early voting usually starts a few weeks before Election Day. And in contrast to Election Day voting, you can go on multiple days. But you can also go to any polling location within your precinct, so the area in which you're registered to vote. You can also do absentee balloting, and I've included a hyperlink here to Ohio's absentee ballot page. But an absentee ballot is for those who cannot or don't want to vote in person. Sorry about that. My mother is leaving, and my dog's going to go crazy for a little bit. Hopefully, I don't interfere too much. Anyway, to get an absentee ballot in Ohio, you can either download a PDF and fill it out, or you can fill out an online request form. Either way, you're going to need to include either your social security number, your Ohio driver's license number, or a photocopy of a state-issued ID. Then you mail the ballot in or submit it online, whichever you choose to do. And then finally, there is Election Day itself, where you will go to the place that is listed on the voter registration card that you will get when you're registered to vote. You'll go to that place and you will vote. For all federal and most statewide elections, Election Day is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November because farmers in the 19th century. Any questions about just how you cast a ballot, how you register, and so forth?
No.
So one thing that's important to remember is that the United States has a federal system of government. That means that some powers are reserved for the state governments alone, some powers are reserved for the federal government alone, and some, or the national government, I should say, and some powers are concurrent, so both the federal and state governments have a say. Really? Anyway, this is one of the reasons why online voter registration is not available in every state. Ohio has it, but Texas does not, because Texas is a separate state. So under the U.S. Constitution, states are in charge of drawing, or after a census redrawing, their election districts. Now, because the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land and state laws cannot conflict with it, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that states cannot redistrict in a manner that deprives residents of due process and equal protection of the law. But otherwise, states are allowed to district however they see fit. Additionally, there are restrictions on what the state can do as far as voter eligibility. For example, under the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry, the dog is not going to be quiet. Anyway, because of the 15th Amendment, states are not allowed to outlaw, or not allowed to stop, for example, African Americans or Hispanics from casting a ballot. Although several recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions have severely weakened the ability of the federal government to actually enforce this law, for now the Voting Rights Act of 1965 still places statutory restrictions on how states can limit voter eligibility. Under the Voting Rights Act, states cannot impose laws or standards which unduly restrict the voting ability of citizens, particularly racial and ethnic, historically marginalized groups. Additionally, the Act outlaws literacy tests and poll taxes as a prerequisite for registering to vote. And the Voting Rights Act allows the federal government to enforce these provisions not only for federal elections, but for state and local elections. However, as I'm about to discuss, other voter eligibility standards are left to the states. For example, I mentioned online, being able to register to vote online. Register to vote online. That's something that is left to the states. Another example would be the eligibility of convicted felons. Some states allow convicted felons to vote while they're still in prison. Others allow convicted felons to vote after they've completed their sentence. And a few states still prevent convicted felons from ever voting again. Any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So it sounds like there is protection for voting rights, but then we do hear that different states are trying to curb the rights, and so maybe you would cover that later on. But I was just curious, are there still existing threats? As a specialist in political science, what are your views on that?
I'm glad you asked, because that's actually going to be the next slide. We're going to cover some of these new voter eligibility laws that have been passed or are trying to be passed. I'm glad you asked about that. Before I get to that, though, any other questions about anything that I've covered so far?
No.
All right. Incidentally, by the way, that's not reflecting on Dr. Johar. That's literally how I do my classes. So let's look at voter eligibility laws. There's been a greater push in recent years to place additional restrictions on both ballot casting and voter eligibility. Now, heretofore, the most common I'm sorry, does somebody have a question? Okay. Heretofore, the most common type of voter eligibility restriction have been voter IDs, and I've linked to Ohio's ID requirements here. 37 states, including Ohio, require a voter to present a valid government-issued ID in order to cast at least an in-person ballot. Now, Ohio's is relatively speaking flexible. For example, in Ohio, you can use your utility bill or your paycheck stub to prove your identity. Other states, however, are going to be more restricted. In Texas, for instance, most of the acceptable forms of ID listed at this link won't work. Fun enough, though, in Texas, if you have a Texas-issued gun carrying permit, that is an acceptable form of ID. Because why not? Anywho, however, particularly in the aftermath of the 2020 election, states have turned their attention to changes to ballot access. As of last June, there are 165 bills in 33 states that would restrict voting in various ways. Most of these bills have to do with absentee ballots. Georgia's law, for example, prevents most interest groups from sending absentee ballot applications to voters. It requires absentee voters to include their driver's license number, and it limits places where voters can drop off their absentee ballots. Other states are trying to restrict early voting dates, require witness signatures for absentee ballots. So in some states, with the laws that are being considered, someone who wants to vote absentee would be required to get an additional signature on that ballot. And in some states, such as Pennsylvania, there are laws that are trying to be passed that would allow state legislators to override county election boards and invalidate the results of elections. However, this push to restrict voting or ballot access is not universal. Kentucky last year passed a law that for the first time allows early voting to take place in that state and gives voters more opportunities to correct their ballots if the state deems them ineligible. For example, if the state determines that the signature requirement is not met, Kentucky voters have more freedom now to challenge that decision, including correcting the ballots to make sure that the signature matches the signature that's on file with the voter board. Meanwhile, the federal government is trying to strengthen what they consider to be voting protections. Last March, the U.S. House passed the For the People Act, which, among other things, would mandate no questions asked absentee voting, require automatic voter registration for federal elections when someone turns 18, and outlaws gerrymandering. So it outlaws the drawing of districts to maximize the voting strength of a particular race or political party. Unfortunately, this law did not make it out of the United States Senate, and to the best of my knowledge, has not revived this year. But critics of changes to voter eligibility laws, this ostensible reform, claim that these current efforts to reform voting are really meant to disenfranchise people, so take the right to vote away from people, particularly black and brown people. Voter ID laws have long been subject to these complaints. Minorities, particularly poor minorities, are less likely to have government-issued IDs, and restrictions on which documents can be used to obtain an ID have long thought to disproportionately impact marginalized groups, particularly naturalized citizens. But certainly criticisms of ostensible voting reform have been subject to complaint to charges of racism and bigotry. Many of Texas's restrictions on ballot drop-offs are thought to be in response to predominantly Black and Hispanic Harris County's decision to expand ballot drop-off points and absentee ballot eligibility in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. Georgia originally had planned to end early voting on Sundays. They were forced to back off of this after civil rights groups complained that the real reason the legislature wanted to do this was because African American and Black churches had been pressing at least absentee ballot turnout, and Texas is a good example of this. Their new laws have made eligibility for absentee voting extremely low already. However, local offices in the weeks leading up to the March 2022 primaries, local officials were rejecting hundreds of absentee ballots as incorrect, and not just because. And oftentimes, these rejections had to do with whether the voter was factually ineligible. In Texas, you can sign up to vote, or for a long time, you can sign up to vote with either your social security number or a state ID number. That, however, would be the only number that the elections office would have on file. So, if, for instance, a voter who signed up to vote with their social security number put their Texas driver's license number down on the ballot, that ballot could get tossed out because the state does not have a record. The elections office does not have that on record. And apparently that is what happened. There's also the fact that the Texas Secretary of State's office has been, shall we say, less than effective at sending out voter application requests, even though federal law says that states have to send out as many voter registration requests as they get. The Houston chapter of the Texas League of Women Voters, for example, requested 10,000 voter application documents, and the Secretary of State only sent 50. The League of Women Voters actually had to threaten to sue the state in order to get the remaining applications sent out. Now, the official line from the Secretary of State is supply chain issues and delivery issues related to the COVID pandemic, but critics have charged that the real reason is just to try and reduce voter eligibility, because doing so would favor Republicans, or at least, again, that's the theory behind it. Critics of voter eligibility laws also claim that these are solutions that are in search of an actual problem. And it is true, and I have to emphasize this because far too many people believe this. Voter fraud is not a significant problem in the sense of being able to alter the outcome, certainly of federal elections, but also state elections. An audit of Texas ballots in the aftermath of the 2020 election is fairly typical regarding state investigations into voter fraud. The Attorney General Ken Paxton's office spent approximately 22,000 staff hours to investigate reports of voter fraud during the 2020 election. There were 11.3 million votes cast in Texas in 2020. Guess how many demonstrable cases of voter fraud there were? Go ahead, yes.
35.
Lower.
17.
Close. 16.
Okay.
Very close. Very good. 16 demonstrable cases of voter fraud. And this is pretty typical. As you can read in this Brennan Center report, one of the proponents of restrictions on voter eligibility and ballot casting point to a conservative Heritage Foundation study that purports to find several thousand cases of voter fraud. What these reports ignore is that several thousand is over the course of 30 years. There were 488 demonstrable cases of voter fraud nationwide from 2010 to 2020, and 105 of those happened between 2015 and 2020. All this is to say that the odds of actual purposeful voter fraud is, well, very, very, very small. Nonetheless, supporters claim that these restrictions are necessary to preempt it. Even if there's not widespread voter fraud now, these restrictions will preemptively prevent voter fraud from happening. The claim is that the contentiousness of the 2020 election counts could have been avoided if there were greater restrictions on ballot casting. And it is undeniable that the public has to be confident in the outcomes of elections. If voters believe that elections are rife with fraud, that the results are not the actual results are not what's reported, then people are less likely to trust the outcomes of elections. As we saw on January 6th, that can have literally deadly consequences. So, again, this is the argument. If voting has to become more difficult, that is an acceptable trade-off to protect the integrity of elections. But I want to know what y'all think. I am genuinely curious, and also in a real course, this is the point where I would open the floor up to student debate. So I ask you, should states impose more restrictions on voting, however you want to define those restrictions? What do you guys think?
I'm just seeing a lot about what's the big documentary out now that people are watching that's like
2,000 Mules.
Okay, right. Yeah. So I feel like they said they videotaped a bunch and then one has been prosecuted, but that was it. So I don't even know how those would violate any of the protections we already have in place, whatever they were doing. So I haven't seen it. I've just heard about it.
I mean, my attitude is that the problem with Dinesh D'Souza, I think that's how I hope I pronounced his name correctly, is I've seen bits and pieces of his quote-unquote documentaries, and this is somebody that Leni Riefenstahl would pull aside to tell him that he's overdoing, that he's not being subtle enough. So I don't know if I would necessarily trust anything he concludes in his documentaries. Having said that, though, that still raises the question, though, even if D'Souza's documentary is false, why take the risk that it could become true in another election? Now, I'm asking asking is that, do y'all think that if you put more restrictions on voting, however you want to define that,
Mhm.
that you will cut down on, that you will make voter fraud even less likely to happen?
Right, and you even isn't he from another country? So I don't know if he like grew up with the American voting system and whatnot. He might
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Dinesh D'Souza. So yeah, I think if they put more what requiring the ID and then requiring that they have like a driver's license or like what they do in other countries, maybe even like watermark or fingerprint and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly possible. The counterpoint I would offer though, and incidentally with counterpoint, please understand that I'm simply trying to get you to think critically. Please do not confuse any counterpoint with me saying that you're wrong. That's what I always tell students. What about the counterpoint though? That are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak? In other words, in trying to prevent fraud, are we depressing the ability of people to make their voices heard in democracy? And do y'all think that is an acceptable trade-off? Like, why or why not?
Well, in light of the very few instances of voter fraud, and again, with my limited knowledge about this, I would lean toward ensuring that people are able to cast their vote and participate in the democratic system. And we need to maybe look at it as a right, that needs to be protected, come what may, rather than, weeding people out because they couldn't. I mean, of course, we don't want voter fraud, and so, I mean, it's a fine balance over there, but I would lean towards finding ways to protecting the right more than preventing. Yeah. Given that the cases of voter fraud are really limited.
Sure. And as Dr. Johar makes a good point that I wanted to briefly mention before we have to move on, because time's a factor. There's not a right to vote in the Constitution in the sense of it being an absolutely protected right. Now, of course, there's the 15th Amendment, there's the 19th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote not be denied on the basis of sex, and so forth. And the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution that there is a right to vote in elections contained therein. But it is not, the Supreme Court has never ruled that it is an absolutely protected right, because the Supreme Court just has determined the Constitution just doesn't say that. I mean, my own value judgment is that it's so heavily implied that it has to be an absolute right. But again, that is my own interpretation of the Constitution. That is my own value judgment. No one will be punished for disagreeing with me. No one will be rewarded for agreeing with me. But yeah, as Dr. Johar points out, there isn't this absolutely protected right to vote. So there's that, as long as that is not recognized, the franchise, the ability to vote, could be diluted. And that raises questions about whether who we have in power, what laws are being passed, etc., will be undermined because not enough people are having their say. We would continue debating this, but unfortunately, time's a factor, and I did have one more area I wanted to cover. Electoral college. On the right here, you can see the map that was in place in 2020. I haven't looked to see, I've lost track of who has how many electoral college votes after the 2020 census. But so, yeah. But what is the electoral college? The electoral college is how we Americans choose the president and nobody else. These are groups of electors who cast a state's vote for who will be president of the United States. States get as many electoral college votes as there are congresspersons for that state. For example, Ohio has a congressional delegation of 18, 2 senators plus 16 representatives. Therefore, Ohio gets 18. And these electoral college votes are assigned based on the population of the state. The more populated your state, the more votes you get. This is why California has the most electoral college votes with 55, while a less populated state like Montana or North Dakota only has 3. Keep in mind, though, that every state will have a minimum of 3 electors because, again, 2 senators plus 1 representative. On election day, when we voters cast our ballots, we're really casting our ballots for the electors to pick our preferred presidential candidate. Once the people's votes are counted, the electors will cast their votes. Is heavily suggested, though in many states not technically required, based on the popular vote. And whichever candidate has the most electors nationwide becomes president. Specifically, whoever gets to 200 and has at least 270 electors. Now, the United States is the only country in the world that decides on its head of government / state in this manner. Almost every other democracy uses a popular vote system, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, 48 states are winner-take-all. That just means that it doesn't matter whether a candidate wins by 5 votes or 500,000 votes. They get every single elector for that state. It also, so if Ohio's voters, if a majority, it also does not matter what a state's congressional delegation is. For example, if Ohio in 2024 were to vote, if the majority of voters decided they wanted President Biden over Donald Trump, Biden would get all 18 electors for Ohio, even though Ohio's delegation to Congress is mostly Republican. It also in every state, a candidate does not have to win 50 plus 1% of the vote. For example, Biden could get 36% of the vote in Ohio, Trump gets 32%, and the rest goes to, all the different third-party candidates. Biden would still win and get all 18 electors. That is how it's done in 48 states. 2 are different. Nebraska and Maine. Those 2 states go based on proportional representation, meaning that it's possible for a candidate who doesn't win a majority of the vote to get at least 1 elector. Let's use Nebraska as an example. Let's say that Donald Trump gets 55% of the vote and Joe Biden gets 45% of the vote. Trump would get a majority of Nebraska's 5 delegates. But because of the closeness of the vote, Biden would still, it would work out to where Trump gets 3 electoral college votes and Biden gets 2, because that's how Nebraska's constitution allows for electors to be divvied up. With such a complex system, why on earth do we do this? Well, the single biggest reason is because of the lowercase r Republican vision of the framers. James Madison, along with most of the other founders, were terrified that allowing too much direct democracy would at best cause dangerous factionalism, at worst could cause demagoguery and the tyranny of the majority. This concern also applied to who would be the executive, the president. Therefore, the framers created the Electoral College to prevent this by taking the choice out of the hands of the people and putting the choice in the hands of the representatives of the people, or anyway, the electors. This was seen as a bulwark, especially since there weren't any constitutional requirements that that electors had to follow the popular vote for their state, at least at that time. But there are a lot of issues with the Electoral College. Because of this, trying to prevent factionalism wasn't the sole reason the Electoral College was created. Citizens in 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, just didn't have access to information like they do now. There weren't too many newspapers. Frankly, most citizens could not read or write. You also didn't have a streamlined process for political parties to choose their candidates. There's also no denying that the Electoral College was in part a way of placating the slaveholding southern states. Since black people in some northern states could vote, and black people, certainly black slaves in the South, could not, there was this fear in the South that the North would be able to dominate the South, and that was going to put the future of the United States as a united country at risk. And so that's why those are the reasons the Electoral College was created. Critics of the Electoral College point out that none of these things are true anymore, so the Electoral College is antiquated. Another big criticism is that the closeness of a vote in a state doesn't matter, since all but 2 states are winner take all. As I said, it doesn't matter if one candidate wins by 5 votes, 500 votes, 500,000 votes. They get all the electors. And so if the goal of the Electoral College is to prevent the majority from trampling on the minority, then doesn't this winner-take-all thing kind of undermine all of that? There's also how electors are divvied up. Bigger states, such as Texas and California, get so many more Electoral College votes that, in theory, somebody could win the presidency just by winning all of the big states and only a few of the smaller states. So there's this contention with the Electoral College that the bigger, more populated states have outsized influence, and that raises the question of whether Americans are being adequately represented in who is chosen as president. But none of this is to suggest that the popular vote is perfect either. One major concern is that going to a popular vote will make presidential elections, even more than they are now, more about who does Joe voter want to, or Jane voter want to have a beer with, rather than the fitness of the candidate. With the Electoral College, there's at least the control of needing to vote. There's this idea that there's greater protections from presidential elections becoming a popularity contest. There's also the fact that moving to a popular vote may not solve the problem of candidates going to the bigger, more populated states. After all, if you have so many people living in California, Texas, New York, etc., than in Kansas or Wyoming or something, even without the Electoral College, you still have very little incentive to go to those states if you're trying to win the most votes. And finally, many of the real and alleged problems related to voting itself, such as voter ID, voters being grossly uninformed, that's not going to get solved with a popular vote. It may, in fact, get worse. So, unfortunately, as I understand the schedule, we don't have enough time to debate this. But one thing that I do want you to consider is whether we should continue using the Electoral College to elect the President of the United States. Any questions or comments before we wrap up? All right. Well, I appreciate you listening to my teaching demo.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Smith, and thank you, other colleagues, for being present. So we'll just take a break here, and then we'll meet with you, Dr. Smith, again in about 10 minutes. Okay?
Excellent.
Thank you.